about
emergency task force for Devon. We will have a few just logistic things to start with that we will read out. And as you have the agenda, we'll do the introductions after we do this bit. So, first of all, on behalf of the Devon Emergency Response Group, Devon County Council will act as data controller for any personal data that you provide to us, specifically images and video collected and broadcast today. As such, Devon County Council will ensure that the data you give us is processed in line with our organization's data protection policies and in line with your rights under the Data Protection Act 2019 and the EU General Data Protection Regulation. More information is available on the privacy notice which you should all have a copy of. Does anyone object to being filmed?
Yeah, I must admit it's very good to see you here on such a difficult day. I believe we're not expecting a fire alarm. I hope we don't have one. It's very difficult to get out of these things. And if we do need to, it's the main staircase you came up with. We are asked to speak clearly, obviously, for the audio, not to talk two people at a time. Carbon plan. And will be submitted to the Citizens' Assembly, which will take place next year. So we hope that they are able to give a clear steer on some of those. So, of course, we have an enormous area of subject matter, and for that reason, I would hope that we'll be able to speak as briefly as possible. We'll start with an initial round of introductions when there's a chance to say, hopefully, your name and your organisation the first time that you speak for the benefit of that. And, but also some of the main things that you are bringing to this session. So it might be, I want to talk about such and such a proposal which is represented. So naturally, disagreement is to be expected, and that is the basis for our conversation there. If you do take a long time, then you will see Emily stopping after doing that after 1.5 minutes, which doesn't mean you have to shut up, but we hope that we can have a 2-minute maximum, just in case we need it. And it doesn't prevent you coming in again, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of interchange in what we're talking about. Okay. So, I believe Laura, do you want to mention the possibility of using Post-its to make points as well?
Yes, so because obviously it's not just about the discussion, but it's the written evidence that we need. And we thought if anyone wanted to write things down while somebody else is talking, we can then at the end put them on the board, perhaps, and then we can maybe cluster in different areas. It's just an additional way to put your views across. Sorry.
It's possible to stick Post-its up on the board, or we will collect them for receipts afterwards. So, can I suggest that we go around and introduce ourselves, again with a 3 minutes limit. My name is Jill Westcott. My most recent reason for being here is work within the transition initiatives, Transition Exeter. I've also been a parish councillor and a smallholder producing cheese and vegetables. So,
my name is Laura Cárdenas. I work at Rockwood Research in our site in Devon, so it's near Oakhampton. We are a research farm, mostly based in our research on livestock. My interest is, or what we have from our organization, obviously, is achieving net zero carbon, but we bring to the table some of our research as well.
Should we just include our Devon County Council colleagues? Do you want to?
I'm Doug Elton. I work in the Environment Group at Devon County Council, working on the Climate Emergency Project. I'm taking notes today.
Hi, I'm Emily Reid. I'm the newly imposed Devon Climate Emergency Project Manager. So yeah, trying to help support this sort of thing.
Well, I'm Martin Brager, based on a farm just outside Exeter. We're organic farmers, been organic for 20 years, and growers. And we started growing a lot of vegetables. We're continually growing more and more vegetables as the demand just continuously grows. We're on this beautiful red soil and a lot of south-facing slopes, so we are in an ideal position to grow organic vegetables and apple trees. Lots of apples. We try to supply it as locally as possible. So we have a box scheme supplying Exeter and the surrounding area. And we do the Exeter farmers markets, and we also supply wholesale shops. So it is possible to grow a vast range of vegetables organically without any artificial fertilizers, using the soil, enhancing the soil fertility with different techniques. And but they have to be seasonal. So, yeah. So I would like to talk about a 10-year plan for transforming farming and growing, and also the distribution and networks for distribution and selling of produce. The one problem we have, it's quite easy to grow organic vegetables, but selling them is very difficult and challenging because of the marketplace. Not because people don't want them, but getting to public is very unnecessary, complicated and expensive. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jennings. I'm the County Ecologist at Devon County Council, but I'm here really representing the Local Nature Partnership today. Is this my 2 minutes?
Yeah,
you go.
so please say a little bit about that.
So just a few quick things that I want to make the link between the climate emergency and the ecological emergency, obviously, and how they overlap. How we can talk about natural climate solutions, offsetting, and it's not just about trees, but also about calm grasslands and peat and hedges and lots of other habitats. The need to develop a nature recovery network for Devon, which Devon Wildlife Trust are leading on for the Local Nature Partnership, and how we can develop that to help with carbon offsetting and also to protect sensitive areas. The potential to develop a Devon land use framework, so we want potentially lots of tree planting. 17% is 1,150 hectares a year. If we did that, then what are the implications in terms of food? So we need to look at this in a balance. Do we want to produce a land use framework for Devon? Also, there are no registered carbon units at all at the moment to buy, so can we have more innovative use of any carbon offsetting funds at the moment to help set this up rather than actually buying units? Could we get some sort of agreement to do that? I don't know. And also the importance of involving communities, good communication, whether we could use the county show this year to do something on this, looking at David. The links between energy reduction measures and the ecological benefits, so dark skies, reducing NPK inputs, things like that. And just an offer of using the Local Nature Partnership to try and help with this. There's links to net gain through development, the Nature Recovery Network, local nature recovery plans. There's all sorts of stuff going on at the moment, ELMS pilots, lots of people interested, so how we can help to bring this together and have a strategic approach. Okay.
I've got nothing left. I'm Chris Gregory, I'm the Land Steward for the Duchy of Cornwall. So in terms of my responsibilities, they include the Duchy's estate, Devon, Cornwall, and the Outer Scilly. It's an estate of about 100,000 acres, hugely varied in terms of its geographic composition, habitat types. It's a let estate, so we don't farm in our own rights, so we have relationships with typically 100 farmers across that patch. I'm also the Duchy's lead on our natural capitals project, which will span probably about 4 years, trying to identify a sustainable management of natural capitals across that let estate. So in that we can't direct solutions and outcomes ourselves, we have to work with our partners in important terms, all of whom run commercial agricultural businesses. So we are absolutely that interface of trying to find sustainable solutions without undermining their own commercial credentials. I'm also very recently appointed to the Duchy's fledgling climate change task force to try and identify how a very integrated estate such as the Duchy's could achieve net zero in a time frame that is commendable.
I'm David Thurston. I do various things which bear on this, and I'll just very briefly say a few things that I think are relevant. First of all, we, as a family, are up in Devon, where we've been for a very long time. This is the latest of a series of things that have been challenging to us. It started with the Black Death and carried on from there. But this is as big a challenge as there's been, in my view. I chair beeswax farming, which is probably the biggest farm in England, I should think. And so we have a responsibility to do that properly. That's part of James Dyson's empire, you probably call it. And there is a real drive there to use the productivity end of agriculture in a responsible and sustainable way. So when I hear, as I heard on Radio 4 at lunchtime while I was panicking about not having prepared for this, somebody saying, well, actually, you can certify where the palm oil comes from, and by making sure that it's certified, grown in places that haven't just been cut down from a virgin forest. But of course, the real answer is meat, stopping the meat. And I'm thinking, what about any distinction between meat that is produced sustainably and meat that isn't? But there's a sort of naivety, and this was somebody who was laying down the law in that way. So it's a subtle, complicated area, but there are loads of things that we could do. I've just been, still going as a commissioner for the RSA Future Food Farming and Countryside report, and one of our strong recommendations was the land use framework. And actually, we've probably got to a stage where if you just leave it to free choice in the market, you're not going to get the solutions that can actually deal with this. So without being over Soviet about it, there are definitely some frameworks, I think, that should guide behaviour. I think the other thing that I'm interested in is, as a land agent, is people working together, landlords and tenants, for example. Chris just mentioned that. I am trustee of the National Trust, and of course, the National Trust is just the same. We've got 600,000 acres, but a lot of that is run through other people's businesses, tenants' businesses, and that has to work. Finally, perhaps I chaired the Southwest Rural Productivity Commission, which looked at improving productivity to actually make sure that what you did well and did it properly. But I think for me there is a big unanswered question, which is how much of the way agriculture, for example, could go will actually provide the food that the nation needs at the price that they're prepared to pay. And I think that's a bit unclear, and that relates straight to sort of trade and everything else as well. So I'm interested in practical solutions.
So I'm Paul Cossington. I work as Environment and Land Use Advisor for the National Farmers Union across the Southwest, so I have a regional role. We obviously represent farmers and landowners, and we have in the Southwest about 10,000 members, of which a bulk of it comes from Devon, so we take sort of 5,000. That is across all farming sectors, so whether that's arable or dairy or livestock or horticulture, and all farming styles. So from standard kind of commodity farming through to organic or having regenerative agriculture is all part of the same family. And one of the things to note for what is the Southwest is we've got the weather for it at the moment. It's very much a pastoral kind of landscape. It's very grassland in terms of what it grows well. And with that, there's livestock and there's dairy. In terms of what it is for climate change, perhaps one of the biggest topic areas for the NFU at the moment is our net zero ambition for 2040. So this has been something that is important to every single one of our commodity boards, and we work with them extremely closely in terms of developing how we're going to achieve it. And we have the beginnings of a plan for it under 3 different themes in terms of what we've done, and we can go through that today. And one of the crucial things for me around this is how positive our membership and the community, farming community, has been about doing this as a task. So seeing it as presenting and providing positive solutions to something that is important to all of us. The thing I would note on this is I've been in this role for 12 years. Climate change has been an issue since I started this, and I've written the Rural Development Programme in the southwest, where it was a large part of what we did. And just kind of noting, Adam Lockyer from Frank is here, we did 10 years ago the Southwest Agriculture Climate Change Conference, which had about 1,000 or so farms coming along to it. So it has been a topic which has been important for an awful long time. And there has been an awful lot of change within what has happened within the farming community. And a lot of that is not just climate change as such, relates to topics of water quality, soil management, how we use nutrients. So all of these have a bearing on what it is to do climate change.
Thank you. Can I just give you we missed you in,
Yeah, I'm Ed Parfaris, Conservation Manager at Devon Wildlife Trust. I'm just here today to take notes.
Somerset, and really I sit on lots of different groupings like the Flood Committee and the Local Nature Partnerships and the Catchment Partnerships. But the one word I'm going to come back to a lot today is around soil, and I'll explain why. It's great that sort of Devon County Council is taking this approach, and I think the sort of need to decarbonise is marked. There will also be a need to mitigate any residual of carbon, and there's a need to adapt to our climate and our catchments to climate change and the impacts of that. And all three of those things are connected. Now, a lot of organisations are stumbling over themselves at the moment to put tree planting in, because that's a really straightforward way. There's a carbon code. It's not plagued by the same dogma carbon offsetting had in Cornwall is planting up 2% of the area to offset 1% carbon. You can see, though, to offset the other 99%, you'd have to plant up all of Cornwall and half of Devon. So we can't do that. Whereas actually, when we look at kind of 38% of our soils are degraded, severely degraded, and actually when we've looked at things like the missing carbon due to that degradation, due to that overworking, or kind of potentially things like sort of difficult cropping, that difference in carbon levels is actually around 20 to 30 tonnes per hectare. Now, actually, when you start looking at those figures across Cornwall, that's 200 times the amount of carbon sequestered through the Forest of Cornwall project. So you can see vast benefit for improving our soils, and that's not just the carbon, that's the fact that those soils, farm soils, would be better at providing food, stop the sort of muddy floods we're seeing at the moment, and the water, sort of water quality and the flooding issues. So there's huge gains to be brought there, but it's a very complicated jigsaw, sort of the negative impacts. So the potential is huge, but because of the issue of carbon offsetting and the dogma in the early 2000s around sort of, especially around tree planting in those days, we need to be sort of like really pushing on that Cornwall Soils Alliance to try and build the capability, capacity and consistency of that approach. So there are things happening already to push on that. I mean, there's also potential that I will go into if we've got time for things like looking at the legal conditions.
In Scotland and Wales, so we work in terms of land managers, but also researchers in our sector organisation. I'd also just have to say, as a civil servant, as part of Devon, when there's a pre-election period, I have to be careful with what I say. So I won't be able to talk about any future grants or future policy. So just make me aware of that. In terms of the sort of things that I'd like to say, certainly I agree totally that soils are absolutely important and that trees aren't the only answer, but they're part of the solution. And certainly I think we need to look at the wider impact of climate change on things like increased trees and plants and disease, pest and diseases, which obviously is going to be caused by the need adaptation of our trees and woodlands. And if we don't do that, we won't be able to get mitigation from carbon. So I think it's a very complex issue, but there's a lot of work we do to get issues around it through research as to the impact climate change has on that. I think we would agree with working with the the LMP, that it's important that there is some sort of land use framework. It is important we make sure that we look at areas where we should be planting, but also establishing where we can. And we've done mapping, etc., that will help that. Other than that, I think we need to look at the economics as well. And in terms of it's looking after, apart from planting new ones, it's very important to be looking after what we've got already. And we need to think about adapting our existing grounds so that they can continue to hold the carbon they do. And obviously, in terms of processing timber, it's important that that timber goes to lock up carbon. So the more we can do to use timber and products, the better. Obviously, we need to be looking at some local use as well, so that we can transport in long distances. So a lot of the timber look at how we can actually improve local processing to actually bring that lock up carbon locally within the North of Devon. And obviously, I think it's also important that we look to neighbouring
development at Devon Wildlife Trust. Just in terms of what we bring, we're a landowner in the county. We've got about 57 nature reserves, which attract hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. We employ over 20 farming and wildlife advisors, so we've got that intimate knowledge of farming and wildlife. So they are the central repository for a lot of habitat and species data and environmental data that we've got in the county. As well as hosting catchment partnerships and delivering some very large landscape scale projects, working with farming communities to deliver successful farming and wildlife solutions. What we're really keen to focus on here is around the need to look at Devon holistically in terms of how we can sequester carbon, to think about, take a real source to sea, atmosphere and soil approach. So that's going right from our peatlands, of which we've got a huge percentage in the county, right through our more intensively farmed landscapes. But crucially, I think, for this meeting, in terms of our wetlands and out to intertidal and sea, and that's something that I don't think the wetland elements are being held, is because Devon is the impacts of climate change are going to be magnified in the county. And we have two upland areas that are probably at the most southwest extent of sort of peat forming habitats, for example. We've got both our coastlines and numerous estuarine systems. So sea level rise and climate change are going to have a magnified impact for us. So the critical focus for us is how do we work with nature, with biodiversity, working with natural processes to provide solutions which give us these benefits in terms of carbon, but for nature and communities as a whole. So very much about taking that holistic approach.
You don't deal much with the intertidal elements of your work. We do have a further hearing which will focus more on the marine environment next Friday from the marine laboratories. But should you wish to submit something written individually to us, then that would be possible.
Okay, my name is David Rookwood. I am the site manager for the Woodland Trust. It's the estate on Dartmoor. But in previous life, I've worked in the commercial forestry sector and in fact for Devon County Council in the past as well on the South West Forest project. So I bring to this, I hope, more about kind of practitioners kind of approach, and actually what delivering forest management on the ground, what that means in terms of timber production, in terms of what that means for the local economy, but also trying to balance those elements with the biodiversity crisis and what that means for species loss, which is happening around us at this moment in time, and also people actually exercising, living their life to people. And whilst we're not proposing issues and climate change, it is part of that kind of story. And Lawrence makes the point quite clearly about soils, and they quite clearly are the most critical element. But woodlands do have a role in that. And Sarah, Climate Change Committee's target, or whether it's the Environment Act target, there's a substantial amount of woodland, a target figure of about 1,100 hectares for Devon alone. The current target or the current planting rates for England are around 1,500 hectares. So that's for the whole of it. So just to put that into context, it's a significant piece of landscape change and permanent landscape change. So I welcome the discussion around the fact that there needs to be a land use framework, because I think without that, without understanding where our farming, our food, nature conservation, peatlands, where all of those elements of our landscape are, it's very difficult to understand quite how we're going to actually take that step and move forward and make the change that's really required. Do we really understand what 2 degrees of change means to our pastoral landscape by 2040? It's going to look very, very different, and we need to look a long way ahead. And I would urge everybody to think not necessarily about the here and now and the issues in their sectors now, but actually think about the issues that are going to be coming down the line in their sectors in the next 20, 30 years.
My name is Adam Lockyer. I'm a Senior Farm Conservation Advisor for the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. We're a charity which provides advice and support to the 5th anniversary this year. So we're a reasonably established organisation in the county and across the region. We have around 45 members of staff delivering farm advice each week on farm. Education, working with the Kingfisher Awards scheme that Mary knows well about, getting children out onto farm to understand food production and farming systems. So involved in a wide range of delivery. I personally sit on the Agri-Environment Stakeholder Working Group for the RPA and DEFRA, so I represent FWAG and the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, feeding back into environmental stewardship and countryside stewardship delivery, so the main agri-environment support schemes, and also we sit on the stakeholder group for the development of the environmental land management scheme, which will be the successor to our current agri-environment schemes, countryside stewardship. And I take a role in terms of coordinating some of the involvement that we have in the tests and trials which are currently going on within the region as to how those schemes develop, of which in FWAG we're involved in the delivery of 9 of those within the southwest, so quite a significant amount of our work. I don't really have much to add to the other comments that have been made so far around forestry, existing new woodlands, soils, biodiversity, ecological emergency stuff, so I won't carry on any more about those. But I feel that there's generally a fairly clear set of actions that, as a sector, we see needing to be done. And there's a big amount of work to look at how we address those barriers and how we look at the combination of regulation, the enforcement of that regulation, advice, and incentives to farmers and landowners, whether those incentives are personal, market-driven, or through support mechanisms. All 4 of those sort of play a role, regulation through to the incentives. So I think that's an important bit of work, especially where we're looking around issues regarding landscape change and our choices of land use and how that conflicts with individual landowners' objectives for their own land or their own businesses and other interests. Also, something that we haven't really mentioned is the role of the supply chain in this and the drivers around sustainable consumption. If we're measuring the footprint of a farm production system or we're measuring the footprint of an individual's diet and consumption, will create very different scenarios, and we can still be producing as much meat as we are locally, but if that's shared out amongst people who are consuming half as much meat, we can carry on the production systems we have and improve them to make us climate neutral as possible. So yeah, I think that sustainable consumption is an interesting element to consider.
Hi, I'm Mary Quick. I'm a farmer and cheesemaker from just down the road. How come I'm here? I mean, I think we've got real interest in soil. We feel that is absolutely critical for the future of both farming prosperity and environmental prosperity. That the NFU is suggesting, but in particular carbon sequestration. We feel, I'm certainly talking with Michael Lee of North Week, he said that as far as an organisation was concerned, they could put carbon sequestration into the too difficult box. I think we need to demand that our scientists take it out of the too difficult box and maybe even show some humility to and start observing what farming systems are that can add organic matter and observe those and characterise and understand those rather than build it up from the base down. That's not a normal way that we do research in this country, but it's a sensible way of doing research and it's done in other parts of the world. We would like a carbon accounting tool so that we can measure and manage. We would like to, I suggest receive support on that. I would really like a soil organic matter tool I can shove in my soil, just like I can measure my grassland, go and measure my grassland and get the growth rates of it. I want it on the end of my phone and I just put a probe in and it feels like there's all of that stuff. I'm a board member of the dairy sector board member of Agricultural and Horticultural Development Board, and I'm really happy that we're turning them on to the environment and making that a main plank of activity there. I would love the Devon County Council small holdings to be doing things to support those guys, to be those people, those farmers, to do that good work. On our arable farming, on our farm we're about half woodland. The half that isn't woodland is more than half is pasture, permanent pasture, and arable farming. And what we notice about the support for arable farming over the past more than 20 years has been very much keep arable farming on arable farms, and that is brutally hard for soils. Those people who think that arable farming is the answer, haven't gone and talked to a bit of soil recently. There's the greenhouse gases, people talk about carbon, it's not just carbon. Obviously it's nitrogen. We've forgotten in this country how to use clover appropriately. All of that stuff that we were taught in the 70s and 80s has largely been forgotten because people want to sell farmers stuff. Methane, in terms of methane, ruminants and methane, I feel that's a concern that people have, and that is, that there's breeding and feeding stuff to be done about that, and researchers and colleges and advisors that we need to wake up and make vivid so that we can actually deliver the results that we all need to. If we added 1% of organic matter to the world's agricultural soils, we would take 100 parts per million of carbon dioxide out of the air, and we're worried about 200 parts per million. I'm not saying that's a total answer, but just as a thought experiment.
Thank you. Great. And
I'm just here to sort of, assisting Tom with providing the live stream and social media coverage.
I'm Tom Dixon, Devon County Council.
So thank you very much. Already that sounds like a very rich conversation starting to happen. So you have the agenda with you, and we're going to start by looking at tree planting, forestation and habitat restoration. You will have seen the questions that were sent out, which are us to those opportunities, and in what ways those, and we will also look at who might do those. So the specific issue of tree planting has been already raised, and I think was raised by a vast majority of the online submissions in this part of the hearing. So would somebody like to kick us off by giving us more detail about how we could find areas for tree planting?
So I kick off. I think it's interesting that you say that you've had people feel well disposed and motivated by woodland, trying to create woodland, and they feel that it's something they can contribute. And I think that's probably quite an important kind of social need that we need to think about, because I think a lot of people are feeling, to some extent, a little bit helpless about knowing what they can do and what their role in all of this is. And there's very much a social aspect to creating woodland and engaging people, and I wouldn't belittle that in any way. I think it's a really important thing. But actually trying to make that step change, and the target you've chosen here is 17%. That actually that's unprecedented. We have not been in that position before. I worked in the Southwest Forest, and the Southwest Forest created 3,500 hectares of new woodland in North Devon. And outside of the National Forest, that was the largest woodland creation project in England. And at its height, it was putting in about 500 hectares per annum. Now, a lot's changed in Southwest Forest. Land values have changed. So one of the reasons Southwest Forest was able to function was because land values were relatively low in that part. And as land values grew, the planting stats declined. And land values are much, much higher now than they were then. And not everything was perfect about Southwest Forest, but it did create a change in comparison to what we're considering now. Hence, I think most of us have started to think that actually some sort of land use framework is probably where we can all mutually come to some kind of agreement about food production, forestry, biodiversity, peatlands. We need to think about that very, very carefully in order to take the next step. And my plea is we try to do that as soon as possible.
Yeah. No, okay. Yeah, firstly, just in terms of, I think, opportunities in Devon, they are considerable. But we do have, I think, the largest area of lowland, less favoured area in the country. You know, there are areas where agriculture is quite marginal, and where tree planting could definitely help. Critical thing around tree and making the most out of that is obviously right tree, right place, but it's substituting other supplies. So there's something there that I think is crucial if we want to maximise the targets, is putting those woodlands to work, which is absolutely.
Adam and David.
Yeah, so I think that in terms of, it's interesting looking back to the Southwest Forest, and certainly I think one of the reasons that worked was apart from there was quite a bit of finance available. It was also because there was a large partnership of interested people from all organisations and the public, as to it was a good thing. And so we mustn't forget that people, it's often easy to find to plant a tree somewhere, but if it's in your backyard, you often find that they lose their view and there's some issues around it. So it's really, in terms of regulation, forestry will have a significant environmental impact. In terms of landscape, then we need to carry out environmental impact assessments. But obviously, if you've already got a wide partnership approach, then that sort of process can be a lot simpler to get through, and easy to actually get through to the planting when you actually find a site to plant. So there are quite a few issues like that which need to be sorted out. Also, carbon, although it was financially beneficial at that stage in Southwest Forest, I think there was one scheme where they got carbon funding, but now obviously there's a greater interest in how we can actually, it's possible for anyone who wants to plant woodland to have it registered under the Woodland Carbon Code, which means it can be accredited, so it can be used in carbon markets in the future. Obviously, those carbon markets are in their infancy at the moment, and that's one of the reasons why we've introduced the carbon woodland guarantee, which provides a guaranteed price for somebody who wants to plant trees and save carbon. But there are some of these issues are quite complicated. It's a matter of trying to explain them in a fairly straightforward and simple way. At the end of the day, it's going to, for landowners, it needs to pay for them to do it.
Thank you. So we have further contributions, but I'm not sure that everybody will make that clear.
Well, I think this is where we know, as sort of several people said, that the right tree planted in the right place for the right reason is going to give us more than a tree, more than carbon. But I think we're not very good at explaining to people where the right place is, what it's doing. And part of the land work framework is really about, it's similar to some of the stuff we've done over the years, over things like ecosystem pressures, where do we need the best places for food. So there's mapping exercises that allow us to explain to farmers where that right place is, what the benefits are, other than just a tree. It gets slightly harder when you also want to sit there and go, the community benefits, and I'd absolutely agree that that's something we need to consider, especially things like recreation and access and those sorts of things. So I think kind of there's several people in the room that kind of can get their head around what things like a spatial framework might look like, a spatial map might look like. The thing I'd come back to though is the price of land has massively impacted. The highest benefits, multiple benefits, are actually some of the marginal land and marginal areas that kind of we ploughed up 60 years ago, and now actually they're the places where it's hard to get maize off of, it's hard to grow a crop because those are naturally wetted areas. So what we're finding when we run auctions and sort of try to get farmers to plant areas up is those areas are easier for them to get their head round changing than areas where they sort of prime agricultural land. So it's important to have that recognition. The other thing that's worth picking out is that if you're taking land out of production, you stop getting subsidy payments on it. And that has a big impact. There's discussions in Elms about agricultural production, so it's not only the value of the land and locking that up for 100 years, it's the fact that you'll lose payments on it as well. So it's something which is a real issue when it comes to trying to find value.
We've got David and Adam, Mary, Martin, Sarah and then Martin. And I'll come to you next.
So, I quite agree about the value bit. I mean, obviously, if you plant trees on some land, you probably harvest value. And if you have got a deal with the bank about the value of your farm and what you're providing as collateral for borrowings for the farm, then the bank manager isn't that happy with that very often. So the income point's been made. I mean, it's not just subsidy, but you have to lock up your money in the woods for a while, and you don't actually get any income necessarily. Skills and management, it does require some skills to manage woodland, and a lot of farmers study altogether. Availability of contractors to help you to do things that you can't do yourself. You haven't got machinery and so on. Particularly if you're operating at scale, is a little bit of an issue. And we're not sort of always joined up on some of these things. So, impact of grey squirrels. Some people just aren't planting broadleaf woodland because of the grey squirrels now in the southwest. It's just wrecking the planting. I don't know if we've ever added up how much carbon is lost by grey squirrel damage to trees, but it's probably quite high. And also which species to choose. As you get phytophthora and all these other things coming at you, and ash tieback and so on, what are you going to choose that's going to last 100 years? And actually, probably the answer is diversity of species, but of course that is not the most economic way to then deal with thinning and harvesting and so on if you've got a variety of trees, although that might be the best to last. And also, little things like you plant them against trees. People are now facing huge bills for health and safety reasons about ash dieback against roadsides. So there's lots of other things that one doesn't think. It's very easy to talk about trees being the answer. I love trees, plant them where I can, but there are some practical differences.
Information deficit areas that you've highlighted, as well as the financial need for recompense, including it in elms and so forth. But I don't know, and I don't know if other people know, whether the first sign of ash dieback is in fact dropping limbs.
No, I think the first sign of ash dieback is when you see a thinning, probably in the winter actually, where there's a reduction in the twigs and off the branches as you look at a tree against the light, and then gradually you realise that it's starting to lose its vigour and so on.
This is important because, for example, Exeter City Council is proposing to immediately fell all their ash trees, whereas many of them look very healthy. But sorry to interrupt.
Sorry, and the real danger is actually you get to the stage where it's too fragile for tree surgeons to climb up, and it becomes too dangerous. Otherwise, it becomes really dangerous for the tree surgeons.
Just on this point, if people look at Devon Ash Dieback Resilience Forum web pages, all information is there around which trees to replace them with, etc. So it's a fantastic resource.
There's guidance from the Tree Council on individual trees and ash dieback, and also we produce information on managing woodlands with ash. So there is information.
So we're having a conversation about a land, I've forgotten how you exist, and Adam, you wanted to say something about that next, and I just felt that some of the reactions had been that this is an entirely what we're going to call it conditional mapping, which is certainly being done, which would show that if farmers wish to plant trees, what sort of assessment would be put on that part of land? Would it be feasible at all, and what sort of trees? Or would it be a framework which would have a degree of regulation? Other people would address that.
Yeah, I did have comments about other stuff, but I think that would be better to come back to there. I think a lot of that information already exists in one form or another. So it's as much a question of compiling that from different sources rather than creating from the website, the government environmental information source, magic.gov.uk, or through projects and partner organisations. So I'd be reluctant to invest too much time in starting something from scratch. And again, the Forestry Commission has a tool that helps identify species suitability against climate change with their ESC tool, their ecological cycle. Yeah, that one. So yeah, there is a lot there that can probably be pulled together between us to raise sort of awareness of what's required.
Can I ask a question here? Because one of the things that we put down was opportunity. So obviously, if the framework is something that will help do this in a more efficient way, because we know where things should happen, and if there is information, is that something that maybe you can, as witnesses, provide where this information is that can be used as opportunities for maybe setting up this framework?
Yeah, although I must say, without being cynical about it, a lot of it comes down to just experience out on farm and being in the landscape and talking to people, and it's not always that complicated of things.
Shall I just say it's worth saying the Forestry Commission have produced sensitivity maps. So basically, it's high, medium, and low sensitivity for tree planting. Obviously, nowhere is excluded necessarily, but obviously you need to be looking very carefully.
You might want to exclude peaks for.
But obviously, there's sites like
biodiversity sensitivity.
But there are a lot of sites which you may say there should be no tree planting, particularly individual trees, and so it certainly gives a good idea. So the yellow on this map is low sensitivity.
Mary next.
Just sort of following on from the sort of economic things, it's just remembering that it's a long old time, and planting a tree is the cheap bit. That's the thing that everyone gets excited about, but it's actually looking after it, and it's a very long time before it earns, and it carries on costing and costing. So in terms of looking at the way, I see you guys are nodding heavily, but in terms of individual landowners and farmers and landowners, it's when I was young and keen, we planted lots of agroforestry, and now it's bloody. The grey squirrels have got in. Fundamentally, those if woodland is unmanaged, and it's really not worth managing those trees. So you have to be able to have these trees so that they're managed, so the carbon comes through and gets reserved into something else. So tree planting just on its own won't play. And just really, again, when I was young and keen, I did a bit of agroforestry, and that I know that's not something that again, I think that's when you're young and keen, that's what you do. But as a system, theoretically, there are upgrades in terms of carbon sequestration, and because you've got the transgressive effects of how you use the soil. Thank you,
Sarah.
Just a couple of things. So the land use framework, I think the idea was that this would be more strategic. So there is lots of information about individual sites for planting. Obviously, you've got to have principles as well, because not everything's mapped. So you do need to ensure that you aren't planting on unimproved grassland, which might not be obvious, might not be mapped, might not be obvious if you're looking at winter. But the land use framework, from talking to partners, this is more about, so if we want to achieve, do we want to achieve this 17% target of woodland planting? Obviously, it's not achievable in the current market. Both the markets are ripe for planting, and lots of people want to start planting. Then what are the implications of that in terms of other land uses? So it's more about, where do we want trees, where do we want become grasslands, or we've got the bogs. Where do we want food production, energy development? It's that sort of level, really, rather than looking at the details of where we want to.
It's finding where those overlap. Is it's the added value from layering those up. And
we have got a lot of that information already, but we've never brought the key partners together. So we've done lots of work in the environment sector, and mapping flooding and biodiversity and blah blah blah. But having those discussions with with the farmers about what food do we want, where, with planners, and I think some work's been done in Scotland. David, you've raised this with the Commission. I have no idea what it would look like or how we do it, but I think we need to have a discussion about.
Sorry, to answer that, may I answer that? Just if you actually are going to be prescriptive, or whether you're going to allow incentive to work, and you can say what would probably be best. And for me, there are other rules other than just the land use. So for example, growing maize slopes. Now is that a land use framework thing, or is it a legislative thing, or is it an incentive thing? I don't know at the moment, but that's what we've got to work out. And these land use frameworks come with them the question about how you analyse the use of land.
An indication of what might be suitable for a certain piece of land, but not a regulatory.
Unless one wants it to be. I mean, that's
but
the
you're
whole
introducing
debate.
the possibility that there might be some things that could be regulatory. I'm going to Martin, then to Chris, and lots of other people.
Can we, I think we probably should move to the next session.
We have run out of time for this session, but I would like to be a bit flexible and extend the discussion so that at least each person has a chance.
Well, I think it was important that you haven't said anything yet.
So, the obvious thing about this is exceptionally complex. Yeah, and there are so many layers. So David just mentioned maize, just as a slight aside. Well, that's actually governed in part by a regulation, farming rules for water, where if you are polluting as a result of planting that crop and there is sediment coming off, as long as there is the enforcement and inspection, then you could be forced to make a change, and something can happen and civil sanctions. So there are lots of interrelated bits and pieces in all this. Part of the thing to note is, something I checked before I came here this morning, was in 1995 there was something like 19,000 acres or hectares, I can't remember which way around, of farm woodland. In 2016 there's just under 24,000. So people are just thinking about what the drivers are for why people will make changes, and obviously there's to do with what it is to have an income, making sure that's right, what it is to have your police, and what it is to have a bunch of laws. We've just done a project up in Gloucestershire with the Woodland Trust where, with our members, we gave out 10,000 trees. Yeah, so Woodland Trust supplied 10,000 trees, we put it out to members, they went within a week. Yeah, and so there was no particular conditions put on it, there was no, you didn't get paid for doing it or anything like that, it was a very simple scheme. And so the point I would make in all of this is there is having woodlands which are of a scale, and that involves a lot of thinking in terms of what your business is going to be. And then there is having woodlands on marginal areas which might be by a river or in a park which is difficult to farm, which is different and is very small. Actually having simple systems where you can get support to put in small-scale woodlands in marginal areas with what I call MEP, minimal effort projects, where you get the tree, pop it in and off you crack, without too much verification and certification, so it becomes unbureaucratic. Awesome. People really like simple systems.
Martin, Chris, and Sarah.
Okay. So, three things. On our farm, we've done agroforestry, and we grow apple trees. And one thing about them is that people really like them. And in September, there was in Marks and Spencer's, I shouldn't name it, but they had a basket of apples, of fruit, and none of it in September was from the UK. It's just so we're producing apples to supply to really local. And the thing about agroforestry is it produces a fruit, it increases the production of the land next to it, and also it acts as it's a permanent piece of strip through an arable field, harbouring insects and beetles which predate the slugs, so that's a really beneficial system. The second thing I want to say, on our farm, half of it we own it and half of it I rent it. So all the habitat restoration, all the agroforestry is on the parts we own, because our landlord always has let us have this land on a 2 or 3 year rolling tenancy. And I'm in my right, I just wouldn't invest in habitat restoration or planting trees on land which I haven't got any links to tenure, and I just wonder how many. With this crazy farm business tenancies we have, with 1 year tenancies or two, it's just ridiculous. It's obscene, actually. And the third thing is, I don't know if you know about the research, but I went to an Organic Growers Alliance conference recently, and there was a really interesting talk about a really renowned organic farmer, grower, who's now planting all his wetland areas, he's planting into willow, especially specific types of willow, and he chops it, he spreads it when it's just at about 5 years age, and he spreads it over all his land before it's in the grass fertility building phase. But the thing about it, and then the following speaker was a guy who was doing research on the beneficial effects of willow, because it actually produces salic acid, which is aspirin. So on all these trees that are dying, you know, no one thinks of, why don't we vaccinate these trees? That was his view. If it was a human disease, why don't we vaccinate these trees? And his research is on about the beneficial effects of wood chip compost, and on any, and this organic grower was using it as a benefit to sequester carbon in the soil and as beneficial to prevent disease. So it's a really interesting project.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you. The Dutchie is 2 years into a project where we're trying to establish land use framework plans on each of our left farms. We're calling them integrated resource plans, and we look at a range of natural capital and ecosystem services derived from that. Just to echo the point really about the intimacy of that process. It does involve downloading natural data sets to inform the surveyors, but the critical part is, and so at that scale, those distortions are actually quite significant. But more importantly, I think, is the integration and holistic solutions. And one aspect or one aspiration can very much influence another. So you might be doing the right thing in terms of increasing tree cover, but you're doing very much the wrong thing in terms of biodiversity, water flows, or whatever it may be. So I think the outcomes of that are proven to be hugely valuable, but the lesson is it's very expensive to achieve it, even if it does have a high degree of sustainability. I think in terms of national strategy, one must be very aware of that. If we're going to get the best possible outcome, it's not going to come.
The costs of CCS are eye-watering. This is by comparison. Right, Sarah, you wanted to come back, and then we'll let you, David, have a little comeback.
Yeah,
and then I think we should move on.
It was just to Paul's point about smaller planting schemes. So from a slightly different perspective, my DCC platform, then we are looking at offsetting carbon. So I've been looking at the Woodland Carbon Code over the last week. And there are no registered schemes for the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peat Code in Devon, which is something that we need to address. Might happen a bit more as it gets kicked off through the government scheme. But also you need generally to have over 10 hectares to actually make this work, to be efficient, because you have to pay all the validation and verification costs. It's really confusing. So I had a look on the website. You know, if you are just looking to buy, you don't want any blah, you just want to know, how do I buy? It's really confusing. So it must put lots of people off to register schemes and to try and buy schemes, although it's something to buy. But if we want to be able to help pay, so businesses and local authorities, who have the money to pay for schemes, it's the smaller schemes that won't be part of the carbon code. So it's how can we try in Devon to set up a simpler, at the moment the only organisations are the Soil Association and another one that I can't remember.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Nationally, which is crazy. So, I don't know, there must be some opportunities to get organisations trained up to do verification at a lesser cost, which would mean that you can account for smaller areas that farmers, landowners, community groups, smallholders want funding for tree planting that they can get from the businesses and local authorities who have the money. So at the moment there seems to be a massive disconnect here into how we can actually achieve net zero through some of the smaller.
Thank you. You're very urgent. I said David could come back and we should move on. So if you could be brief after that, yeah.
With the great respect to all colleagues here, I think the discussion is getting into the detail, and a lot of the issues that we've discussed are well rehearsed. We know the answer. And the point I was trying to make about the land use framework is that really, if trees are seen as part of the solution, it's a societal change. It's not just a bit of planting here or a bit of planting there. It's actually a mind shift. we've got to get away from some of the detail that's bogging us down, and we've got to actually shift the dial. And I think one of the benefits that might come from a framework is, as you alluded to, David, there's essentially a historical concept of planting trees. So there's a cultural aspect to it. So it's difficult for a landowner that's worked their land for so many years to actually make that shift. There's an economic issue that actually maybe the framework, rather like a planning framework, can actually help unlock some of this additional investment that might come from the private sector through the carbon code or other schemes. Because it's quite clear that the financial incentives that currently sit there are insufficient. And I would, implore you all to think about it as a significant step change. If we're not prepared to make that societal change, we won't be able to make the difference.
So very, very briefly, I just wanted to make a point around that we can very quickly get into the discussion around planting trees. We've got a lot of trees in our landscape. We've got a lot of trees which combine our 53,000 kilometres of hedgerow, of which a huge proportion are flailed annually. They could be huge sequesters of carbon for wood fuel. And that's a huge resource. We've got to think more around agroforestry we talked about here. That's absolutely critical. And planting isn't always about trees and tubes of plastic. Natural regeneration has a critical role here to play as well. This doesn't always have to be about buying a whip and putting it in the ground in a tube of plastic.
A lot of people have said that rewilding is preferable.
And just as a solution, why don't we think here about there being a county forest?
Few nods for that. Thank you very much. You still have your post-its?
Sorry, yes. Can please, if you want to add anything else, put it on the post-it note and then you put it on the board.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, just, I know we're moving on. I know I have a habit of doing this. But it's also, we do need at some point, I presume there's no time now, this is about other habitats as well. It's not just tree planting, but we have carbon codes with peat as well, and we have no registered sites. It'd be great if the Duchy can do something on Dartmoor about that so we can buy carbon there. And it's also calm grasslands can be used in peat and code for a calm code that I know people are looking at. Hedges, absolutely. I know the hedge group are really interested in doing stuff on that. So there are all sorts of other habitats that we really need some resource to try and work out how we can get some codes to have some sort of verification process to get funding to create, restore, manage lots of Devon habitats.
Are you assuming some of that funding would come through people buying offsets, or do you mean just for grants or for whatever you need to prove the carbon?
Well, they can't buy offsets at the moment because there isn't. There aren't any.
So price carbon at £200 a tonne and suddenly everything works.
Check it out.
And this is critical if we want to, try and link up ecological emergency with the climate emergency, get able to use the funding that is going to be coming through. We don't have a system that works at the moment. We have no carbon units registered, and we don't have the schemes set up for the other habitats or the soil. And we just need to get this sorted.
My question was, where do you envisage that coming through grants and so forth?
So in my 2-minute spiel at the beginning, I just posed whether it might be possible that instead of, say, some of the offsetting funding that is going to be coming through, is it possible, rather than buying offsets at the moment, which you can't in Devon anyway, so rather than spend that offset funding in Northumberland or Africa, which people very well might do, can we try and use that funding to set up some of these systems or unblock?
Yes, that's what I understood.
Cheaper offset in Africa, then you might actually get more carbon for your money.
I think offsetting is such a contentious issue because there are competing for that carbon reduction. There are things like other Devon areas, such as hospitals, that might need to go on emitting some carbon for various things. There are other parts of UK, metropolitan areas, that might look to Devon to sequester some of the carbon they're producing. There are global situations, such as, countries which might perhaps not be able to reach net zero to the same extent as Britain. So who should benefit from those offsets, and should it be the people who are going to go on emitting with carbon? fossil fuels. So I'm just saying that it is very contentious and that we probably don't have time to discuss it at the moment. But I think it is important to go on looking, perhaps, you raised a very important question as well as through planting schemes. So again, here you have already alluded to the need for farm practices to alter, and perhaps this is as much of a cultural change, I don't know, but I'm sure that there will be some good examples.
And it could go, like Dan said earlier, it could go into quite a lot of detail around them. But we have to be careful about how much weight we put on sequestering carbon into cultivated land, because it's only there as long as you carry on undertaking a land use which is sustainable. You know, if we to use it as a way of offsetting and reducing other emissions from other sources, I would suggest is not an appropriate thing to be doing, because 5 years later, if it's cultivated, it's back in the atmosphere and nobody's benefited from it. So
you can't think about the carbon sequestration from woodland because it will go somewhere else. It's important to see it on a system scale, so that if you have farming systems that create an average carbon and an average carbon increase, that's where you get it. Yes, of course, you can take a plough and completely bugger up mess up a field of permanent grassland. But actually, if you do that, but then you put a rotational grass crop in there, then on average, over a landscape, college to do, the potential for carbon sequestration on cultivated land. And first of all, she refused to look at grassland because it's too complicated. And then she actually didn't. Carbon might stop society. The notion you might be able to sequester carbon in soil would stop society looking at other carbon sequestration. So it's really recognising that there's a concern in the climate change community about responsible communication, but it's also important to see it on a system view, so that it's fine to sequester carbon in ground, knowing that over time that field may change, but you can, as long as you cycle it back over a land area.
Well, so your point is that we're looking at systems and not just at the one particular practice. So we've got Lawrence, Martin, and Paul.
So just before I start one, I've got to go at 3. So I've got a feeling this session will carry on after the 3 o'clock coffee break.
So we'd like to hear from you.
But I mean, this issue of soils, as I outlined, the potential for soils to sequester carbon is huge because of how much degradation we've done. But the reason why we started the Devon and Cornwall Soils Alliance isn't predominantly due to carbon. It's due to the fact that I've come through storm after storm and flood after flood, which has half of our sort of Devon soils washing out. The carbon is just one element. When we realise that when we're degrading carbon, we're degrading the potential for things like fungal hyphae, for knitting the soil together. There's all sorts of things. Very, very complicated, all of that dynamic. But it's hard. It's just one element. At the moment, we're paying for soil management because of the fact that we're trying to talk to farmers about why it's good for them and why it should be something we're doing anyway. We're talking because the water company doesn't want soils in their abstraction point. We're talking to them because of the fact that we don't want soils coming with water flooding our landscape. So there's loads of reasons already why we're doing this. Carbon and the ability to have a soil carbon code just helps. It's another reason why we can sort of financially incentivise that. We've already heard about the fact that there's things like new farming rules for water. They're not particularly well enforced. So the baseline of what has to happen isn't often there. We do work through incentivisatory mechanisms with farmers to try and increase the amount of the health of their soils. I'm not going to talk around just the carbon there. But again, trying to find the right indicators. So we do a lot of benchmarking of organic matter, of carbon matter, but it's always about benchmarked against what that soil should be. And so the thing you pick up is soil type. Over so that way, you'll find very light sandy soils that by nature don't have a high organic matter and high carbon matter. If you go that way, you'll tend to find soils that do have a carbon and high organic matter. So there is a trying to find out what's appropriate for that soil type, for that farm, and trying to build that. And whilst I completely agree on from your side and on the potential to do damage, that's why the schemes we need to invest in do need to have that nuance about this is a long-term plan, not a short-term issue. So anyway.
So can I just ask, because you're only here for a short time, what do you see as the obstacles to that carbon code for soils, and what support and help would you need?
We're already doing a lot. So we're doing work with Northwick, we're doing work with Dutch College. There's lots of different things that's happening on trying to benchmark. The real thing is it's a very complicated setup. So we're having to try and create something a bit more clunky and simplistic. And I think the hard thing is if it has to be based on if you're trying to get to the same level of robustness that we have in things like the woodland carbon code and the others, we will spend all of our money benchmarking and none of it on actually being able to incentivise, because we'll spend. So there are modern bits on it, but you have to make assumptions based on that. And this is where actually pairing it with the other benefits that are derived in terms of water quality, flood risk, biodiversity, I think we should have more flexibility in what the benefits of a healthy soil are. So it may be that it's 10, 20% of the cost for the committee paying for the other proportion. We should just be comfortable that there's a degree of uncertainty. So,
do you think it would be helpful if the framework, for example, included at different levels those soils that are requiring building up organic matter, for example? So normally we say, these soils are high organic matter, these are low, but we are not saying we need to work on these soils to build up organic matter. So maybe looking at it from a different angle.
Trying to find something. The most simplistic one we've used at the moment is taking digging a hole in the middle of your field, and digging a hole on the edge of your field, kind of in an area where you're not working in the same way, but it's not just under a tree, and being able to compare those two, because you've got the same soil type, you've got one thing right now. I can go to fields where they're arable cropping, and yet they are organic matter, good level of carbon, whatever test we did in that. Whereas actually, I can go to other fields in the same sort of catchment, the same sort of area, and you can find a marked difference between them. In the very basic form we're doing with farmers with that, it is kind of happy face, sad face. Are you where you should be for that soil type? And actually, what we're finding is the where they aren't where they should be. That's where we're getting the flood risk problems. That's where we're getting the water quality problems, and that is where there's a huge potential for carbon.
Thank you, Martin and Paul.
So we take soil tests every year in a 6-year rotation. We have a 6-year rotation, and our organic matter in our soils, which is this red Crediton series soils, I have to say, we were very bad farmers. Arable farmers used to grow continuous wheat. They've gone from 2% to 6, well, between 5 and 6% in 20 years, and I think part of don't know why they've gone up so much. I can't calculate it. However, we do have the 6-year rotation, and 2 of the years, because we can't use artificial fertilisers, 2 of the years are for fertility building, and that's grass clover lay. And we realise, and a lot of these lays like fast and fast, and they're just incredibly adaptive lays. In the organic system, any artificial fertiliser, they just grow. So it produces. It actually exudes sugars through the roots to feed all those organisms in the soil. So you were talking about fungal organisms and bacterial organisms, and those fungal organisms are colloiding. I think it's glutamine colloids the soil, and that gives real stability to the soil. So, and then unfortunately we use a ploughing technique because we plant direct, and we just need to be really efficient in our planting. It comes down to the price of producing food. We just have to, we plant 60,000 litres in 12 hours because we just have to get on and do it. And so we unfortunately use a ploughing system and then cultivating power harrowing. And we plant and we do weed, but then we have a system where, wherever possible, once the crops are mature, we just allow the weeds to come and grow, and they're really beneficial. So they're covering the soil in between the lines of crops. And so over winter, it's just really essential from beginning of September onwards that everything in the soil is covered. But you look at some of the fields now, and all these bare soils in the winter, But it's been a terrible year this year, and I feel really sorry for the arable farmers because it hasn't stopped raining since September the 20th, so it shouldn't,
Thank you.
crop.
So I think one of the things we shouldn't be scared of is using the word profit and understanding within a business context, which is what you have businesses running, that actually they've got to remain viable and they have got to pay for themselves. And so part of all of this is relationship with carbon and soils with carbon, and actually just increasing what it is you're doing, increasing last rural development programme 2007 to 13. For my mind, the most successful element of that was a scheme called Soils for Profit. And that was where farmers were able to access advice, which was delivered from Natural England, to get advisors to come out, look at their farm, look at what they're doing with their soils, to understand how they should use it. Deliberately, the word profit was there because it actually helped speak to people in a certain sort of way in terms of what they could deliver. But actually, what you were delivering and what you do deliver doing that kind of thing is not only improving your productivity, and that's not having more of things, that is actually being more efficient and better at what you do. But at the same time, you start looking at better soil structure, which means actually you're not going to need quite so many nutrients going on there, what actually means you've got a cost saving within your farm, so it's more profitable. Actually, you're locking up more carbon, you're storing more water at the same time, so you're doing it multifunctional. But it all goes back to how do you speak to people and how do you do things.
So are you making a case that this is a matter for education in our country?
There is
rather than altering the incentive structure.
Devon and Cornwall Soils Alliance, for exactly that reason, to try and build that capacity and capability. Ever since we lost ADAS, and we had sort of several thousand advisors out helping farmers understand that transition, we don't have that anywhere near that number of people. We've lost huge amounts of soil science knowledge out there.
So just one of the things, I've written down here, use of knowledge, and Northwick has got an amazing amount of knowledge in terms of what is being done.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
And there is a lot of best practice and science around doing this stuff. It's just about how do you get it down to the people there. And to my mind, you definitely need good advisors and they need to be of a standard. Actually, the best way to do it is skill up the farmers in the first place. We've gone part of the way there, but obviously we haven't been entirely successful because there is so much more.
Do they teach biology so agricultural college?
I'm sure they do.
I don't think they used to. They're only just recently.
That sounds very strange. Adam.
Oh, Mary was first.
Sorry, Mary.
Well, following on from that profit motive, there's also as it were, the education piece, not only of farmers, but also right the way. There are people who just eat because that's what they can get. But there is a cohort of people who, if you like, conscious consumers. And for those people who can make food choices, those people who are able to make food choices, for them to be able to make food choices such that the foods that they buy are actually constructive, because they are, carbon generative, or soil organic matter increasing farming methods, and you can start then pulling it through the system rather than having to do it all by sort of government diktat and support, which, as we know, it turns on and off. It's at the whim of the politicians' wish.
So, are you suggesting some additional mechanism for consumers to know that?
Yeah, and I think that comes through from, the French do a day of taste where all school children understand about food. Well, we would probably want to add some more environmental stuff on that, how food is produced in a way that's environmentally positive, but also creating, turning retailers onto this and turning consumers and food accreditations. And I know that those are difficult, but actually the more you can have people make appropriate choices, then they can choose whether they're eating embedded orangutan or whether they're eating carbon that's being sequestered.
That's another technique.
I'm going to end up referencing Paul from yesterday, but the problem with that approach is to friendly food and consumption to be a middle class choice. It has to be across the food sector to be able to do it. So, whether we need to move quicker than allowing it to filter through.
Sure, I'm not saying it's the only thing, but I'm saying that start doing that as well as all the other things.
I mean, we're seeing rapid changes in a specific reference on Exmoor. The changing in the agri-environment support alongside other drivers, but it's becoming harder to access for upland grass farms, which we want to change because there are other benefits society they're providing they can benefit from. But we're seeing a real resurgence in the interest in grazing management in grasslands, and we're having these kind of conversations about rotational grazing and the diversity below ground and above ground in terms of rooting structures. And it was only 4 or 5 years ago where herbal lays as a concept was pretty unusual, whereas now for us it's normal talk for farmers. So it is encouraging. There are things can move quite rapidly, particularly when you're talking around cropping and land use choices which are made annually. It's harder when we're talking about infrastructural changes, which require significant capital investment. Well, if it's around handling how you house cattle over winter, things that are going to take significant up to split your field in half and rotate your grazing, you can do the next week after you've been to the fields, and we see people doing it.
So we're talking here about changing or how we can manage cultivated land to sequester carbon better. I think we've got to take a few lessons, I think, in terms of just what's changed over the last few decades in the sheer quantity of biodiverse tilled, so ploughed on steep slopes, especially where we've got friable soils in East Devon. And, there's substantial, in effect, we're mining and losing carbon from those habitats. So I think there has to be recognition that there are certain practices which aren't sustainable and we can't maintain them on the sorts of soils that we have in specific locations, and being really clear about where those areas are. I think there's something here about society as well, in that we see our rivers, now brown, and we're seeing soils which we pouring off many fields. Yet that's not seen as impacting our future health and survival on Earth.
So, are you making a concrete suggestion about how that should be prevented? Are you talking about fines or?
No, I think there's another. It's got to be multifaceted. Firstly, it's about what we're referring to here. It's about the education and the support for landowners is absolutely critical. And a huge amount of the skill set and soil science knowledge has gone with that. I think that is fundamental. The third sector is helping to provide those sorts of services. But we need to support through one-to-one advice. Farmers who want to uptake new techniques and support soil.
Can you just say something? So based on a few of the comments, and there seems to be a big thing about cultural change, so about changing people's behavior. So is it that more or some strategies should be put towards improving that communication and passing on what we know and what we think should not be done?
Yeah, absolutely.
Should be done.
Can I just come in on that? I just think it's really important to have a lesson from history. If you recall, the first arable aid insisted on, as it were, that the acreage payment should all be paid on arable, and that for the permanent grassland, for grassland crops, it was all going to be paid on the animal. And what this actually did in that huge land use change that happened, was happening, but in particular happened from then on, was that lay farming, there was this huge government support. However valuable permanent grassland is, it's important to see it as part of a whole system rather than either grassland or arable, because it's when you have just arable you start having these major problems.
I think it's critical. Making proper use of rotations, as you say, but just other techniques like minimum tillage.
Yeah. But you can't do no-till. You can't, because I tried it. If your soils haven't got sufficient organic matter, it doesn't work.
One of the things that's always interested me is how you get farmers to care more about their own farms. Now, a lot do, but some find they've got to the stage where it's so complicated that they are completely in hoc to the advisors that advise them. And those advisors not only provide some of the inputs and sell some of the inputs, but they also drive the rotational practice and everything else. So I've seen it happening close to me at home. So, and so the farmers that have themselves abrogated their responsibility for taking control of their own systems that operate on their farms. One of the things I always thought would be interesting would be to, when people submit their annual accounts, to actually just produce two balance sheets, a balance sheet that's part of their accounts financially, and a balance sheet which is a balance sheet of the natural capital on that farm. Because at some stage you get to a level where when you're selling a farm, the natural capital on that farm is part of the assets of the farm and is recognised as such and is put in a set of sale particulars. And suddenly you get people realising that some of this soil that is running down the roads and rivers of our county at the moment actually is not only not good for their farm, but it's also the level of topsoil, the value of that farm for the future, value of their pension pot. It starts for them to take a serious, and it's about being responsible for the impact on their own bit of Devon. And I think we need to be clever at getting people to take that responsibility that happens, particularly for those who do, as I say, leave it to others to tell them what to do on their own farms.
Paul and David and Martin, and then we will have a tea break.
So just a couple of things. There was a successful project, and I'm pretty sure it was up in Y, so the Y and Us Foundation. And what they did was a soil carbon or soil organic matter project where they were going around to different farms and doing an analysis of how their organic matter was in there. And then they showed that farm in terms of where their number was in comparison to everyone else. Yeah, and one of the things that does is some folk are inherently competitive. But if you see yourself right at the very bottom and everyone else is up here and you've got the same kind of thing, it does not tell you that there is something to be done. So actually how you express yourself is really important, which then that relates to actually knowing what is good and what is a baseline and what is a benchmark for it. So, and the other part relates to this thing of we've been talking about farmers. There is no such thing in my head as farmers. There is a vast scope of different types of folk. From one end you've got a challenged enterprise where they are failing in some way financially because they're losing money, something which is is able to see things over generations and do things as a long-term sustainable through to small family farms, and they all have different drivers and approaches. And so in order to get these kind of solutions right, you have got to speak to a load of different people. And getting that communication right, I think, is key. And I think, personally, I don't think always the NFU speaks at that point, or whatever it is, or I've lost Mary. You know what I mean? But each person needs a different way of speaking to. So if you're doing something like soil or woodlands or something, the ticker for the different person is going to be in a different way.
We had some negative comments from David about farm advisors, but is there actually a plea for more resources into support and advice for farmers?
Not from in a particular way, not so much the advisors of which for the farmer to then take more responsibility.
I've just said when we finding that a lot of others have got a lot of farm and wildlife advisors on the ground who are providing this sort of advice, and the demand far outstrips supply. There's a real call for that sector is a real concern.
Thank you very much. There was someone else. Martin and David and Mary.
I'm just going to be incredibly controversial and say I think we ought to stop growing maize for biodigesters. I just find it.
We'll come on to biofuels, but I have no I will note that comment.
Well, it's just from an energy audit point of view, they just have a look.
It is extraordinary.
And we're importing all these. We import 50 out vegetables from southern Spain when we could be growing up from here. And instead we're putting the land into growing maize what's that an issue with that thing?
And it drives quite short-termism in tendencies and land use, doesn't it?
Oh,
From our
yeah.
experience. So.
And it's all based on a subsidy, it's not.
It's all based on a financial structure, yes.
So we have to, the Devon going to have to review the plan on this, because I just think what's going on is quite outrageous.
Thank you. I think we might come back to that topic. David, Mary, and yeah.
So this is actually a question, as I'm wondering beyond my group here, in terms of whether the natural capital work that you are undertaking, in terms of the audit, clearly there's an element of whether natural capital can become capitalised in some way, which I guess is this magic bullet we're all searching for, whether that's for woodland or whether it's for farming or it's for soil carbon. And I just wonder whether for those really more from the agricultural sector, do you see that as a potential future driver?
Yes.
Yes. And the development of the environmental land management scheme has a big focus on natural capital in terms of how we value it, which things we can value, which things we can't value, and therefore we just accept or we make a proxy measure against, and we decide what socially we're prepared to pay for it. So some things can be monetised, some things shouldn't be monetised, and some things can't be monetised.
Thank you. Okay. Mary and Paul.
You were talking, Chris. You raised the issue about advisors on, and so I want to address that because I feel one of the things actually I don't think we've had in this country, but the best farming countries do have. I mean, even when we had ADAS, but really getting those linkages between farming researchers, advisors, and educators, and having those really well working, so not only in terms of farm profitability, obviously, farm sustainability across the piece, whether that's environmental or cultural or societal or economically. But you have to get all of those people communicating, otherwise you get these unbalanced advisors, or you get the researchers not only being funded to do blue sky or environmental and not to do any of that translation and extension and knowledge exchange. So it's finding ways of restoring those linkages and two-way communication between all of those four axes.
Thank you. Paul.
Just kind of answering on the natural capital one. So we held an Uplands conference and asked a question to 100 or so of the farmers about their view of natural capital and whether they saw as a way forward, and over 80% said yes. Yeah, so people do see those things. And the other way that is kind of shown, I suppose, is actually the uptake of agri-environment schemes. So 70% of the land used to be under an environmental scheme. So people will do those, and they've all made choices in various different ways in terms of how it fits into their farming system and what it means to them. The thing we have to do is make sure those schemes are right, and people will take them up. The difficulty we've got is those schemes are all coming to an end. And down here in 2022, you're going to lose a whole load across our uplands like Dartmoor and Exmoor. So what is going to happen to those? Speaking with one of the advisors on the levels of Moors and Somerset the other day, in 2021, over 220 HLS high-level schemes will come to an end. Okay, and so at that point, people make choices. So we have to be able to enable people at these points to make choices, otherwise they will change.
And that's a good opportunity. It can be a good thing from our perspective, because we're coming to this point and we've got just these next couple of years are going to be really critical as we enter the cap transition period as basic payments rolls out and future comes in.
Just to note, this is doing things above what is a regulatory threshold. Yeah, so you already have a threshold which you are required to do by law, and there will be concerns around what it is beyond which is paid for. And it's either comes through contracts, so a lot of contracts, like if you're with Arla or something like that, the kind of dairy processes, you will be required to do other things. But yeah,
there's already a lot of carbon footprinting within the dairy.
But it doesn't, for instance, the Arla system does not take account of carbon sequestration, carbon woodlands, or nothing of any of this stuff.
And they drive efficiency and
drives efficiency. It's really that system is designed to have Danish and Swedish farmers look great, because they don't have much farm woodland, they don't have grazing, and they don't have hedges.
If the cows were housed all the time and they were just being fed in front of them, then you score really high on the carbon footprint. And that's one of the problems with carbon footprint.
But that's why I think we need a carbon accounting tool that actually is really transparent about what it looks at and allows consistency. Because each carbon footprinting tool I've had a look at has an angle. It's trying to support either high yield or carbon sequestration.
It's such a crucial thing. So if you're going to do that, you need it to be universal standard. But my obsession at the moment is around what it is to deliver increased reductions or leaching of nitrates. Some of the tools that you get around to give those figures, actually if you get a nitrate figure, you're also getting phosphates, but actually if you're getting phosphate as well, you're getting greenhouse gases because you're looking at the land management operations. So actually you need something that's holistic, which looks at all of what we're doing in the farm. And then at that point, it becomes interesting because then you can start associating what it means in terms of cost savings, what it means in terms of delivering of the natural capital. So whether that's carbon or delivering water storage or something, you start getting a proper picture of what you can do with your land, which I presume goes into your land use framework. What is it you want to be doing?
Thank you, Chris.
Absolutely. I think it's fair to say that we have a blind faith in the potential of natural capital, simply because it's about a value ultimately, but we don't know what those values are. So in the work we're doing, we're taking that giant leap really on the premise that there will be some reward at some point in the future for landowners and for farmers. David mentioned the importance of the potential ecological and environmental balance sheet. You can't produce a balance sheet unless you measure what your assets are. Fundamentally important to understand what those are. You can't properly manage them unless you can measure them in a change. All that sounds quite complicated, doesn't it? So much of this is complicated, and what worries me in the context of a climate change emergency is that it takes such a lot of time to actually put in place in a really robust way. So if we wait for the new agri-environment schemes now for 5 years, whatever it is, we potentially wasted 5 years of beneficial soil management. And just an absolute plea, this point about not enough advisors on the ground, we need to effect change as soon as we possibly can. And that's about having the right conversations with the right people on the ground and responsibility and getting out there and sorting out this as soon as we can.
Can I just add to that our tendency around looking to the future and how we could account for carbon, sequester carbon, is to make things infinitely complex. Natural capital accounting can be a very academically exceptionally complex process. And we have an emergency. So we don't want to be sat in darkened rooms for 5 years plugging figures away in a computer, whilst we could be making some of the quick wins now on the ground.
Okay, so I think Sarah.
It was just really quickly on the advisor side. So for quite a few years, I've been talking to Paul and one of Adam's colleagues about advisors in Devon and standards for advisors and getting farmers to question the training that their advisors have and whether we can have some sort of standards in terms of ensuring that advisors have got basic soils, water, wildlife training, and maybe an advisor award as well, is something that we were talking about. So just ensuring that the advisors going out there do have the basic training and can signpost as well to other people, because it's all quite random, I think.
You have to define who an advisor is, because it might just be a salesman.
Yeah.
So from the point of view of the Devon Climate Emergency Response Group, a lot of the things that have been talked about are at a national level. So we're going to have a tea break now, but perhaps people might like to consider who needs to act on the kind of things you've been saying. What I've heard is that it would be great to have a natural capital approach, but that in view of the emergency, other things need to happen much more quickly than that to get on board with it. So perhaps, and at the end of this session, we're going to have a review about what suggestions we might make to which particular agents. And I'm looking at this even in terms of, local parishes and town councils. So I would be grateful if you had some follow-up comments about who might be able to do what. Thank you very much. We'll reconvene at 12:30.